It didn't start with fire. It started with light. Light too clean, too sharp to be natural. Light that didn't flicker, but seemed to observe. The date would later blur into memory, but for many it was a Tuesday. Somewhere between the end of spring and the beginning of heat waves. The day the sun came too close. At first, there was nothing extraordinary. In kitchens across the world, kettles boiled. Subways surged beneath cities. Children dragged backpacks across schoolyards. Men in suits frowned at glowing screens. Everything ran, as it always had, on the invisible breath of electricity and orbiting machines. The hum of modernity. Then the shimmer came. Not all at once, and not with thunder. More like a shimmer across the top of the sky, like heat off asphalt, but in the open air. Birds fell strangely quiet. A golden arc bled across the heavens, stretching from horizon to horizon, like a god's eyelid cracking open. People stopped. Not because they were told to, but because something deep in the body, older than language, told them this was not normal light. Above Earth, in the deep black where satellites live and die, a burst of electromagnetic fury screamed across space at 1,000 kilometers per second. A full halo coronal mass ejection, a solar belch from a star older than civilization. Scientists had seen the signs. A few had sent out warnings, but the data arrived too late. The pulse hit. Satellites flickered, veered, and vanished. The International Space Station momentarily lost orientation. Deep-sea internet cables experienced directional power surges. GPS constellations fractured like broken glass. And for the first time since the Cold War, NORAD radar went blind. But on the ground, the consequences were stranger, more intimate. Electrical substations buzzed with raw heat. Some melted outright. Others erupted in sprays of glowing arcs, sending showers of copper and flame into the dusk. Transformer boxes groaned and died. The night ahead would be darker than any in a century. In offices, computers froze. Files vanished mid-keystroke. In hospitals, backup generators stuttered to life, but it was already too late for some patience. On a freeway outside Los Angeles, a digital traffic grid rebooted with no data, throwing signals into chaos. Hundreds of fender benders, 2 highway pileups, and then silence. People stepped from their cars and looked skyward. Because that's when the auroras began. Golden, violet, green. Not at the poles, but over Kansas, over Morocco, over the Ganges River and the Australian outback. The sky sang in silence. Not chaotic, but patterned. Arches of light woven like ancient scripts too vast to read. People said they felt watched. In a Canadian farm town, an old ham radio operator caught the final fading burst of a NASA solar warning before the signal collapsed. He scribbled the last words on yellowing paper. Cycle instability. Prolonged CME chain reaction. Multiple pulses likely. No one heard the rest. By midnight, Earth was silent. No internet, no cellular towers, no satellites, no television. Only analog radios crackling with indecipherable static. Across the globe, the world remembered candlelight, remembered how to make fires, remembered the chill that comes when refrigerators go dark. Some panicked, some prayed, some simply sat on their porches and watched the sky burn, because the stars hadn't left. They were brighter than ever, as if the veil of human interference had finally lifted. And in those first hours, the true fear was not the loss of technology. It was the realization that nothing could stop the next pulse. It wasn't just one flare. It was a rhythm, a new kind of weather, a breath from the sun, a pulse that had just begun. The second day was worse, because it was familiar. There were no screams in the morning, just a strange kind of hush, like the earth had stopped to listen to its own heartbeat. And then came the fire. It began with a deep, subterranean thrum. No one could quite place the source, but everyone felt it. An ache behind the ears, a ringing in the teeth. Dogs howled. Birds took flight and did not land. Then, at exactly 6:13 a.m. UTC, the second solar pulse struck. Unlike the first, which had been graceful, even beautiful in its destruction, this one was violent. Raw plasma and particle storms slamming Earth's magnetosphere like a fist through glass. The auroras went mad. What had been elegant light turned into jagged, flickering arcs, like torn circuitry across the sky. And then, one by one, the fires began. In Mumbai, a commuter train locked its brakes and skidded through a crowded intersection. In Alaska, an oil field control station shorted out, igniting storage tanks in slow, thunderous succession. Across the American Midwest, power transformers exploded with such force that some mistook them for bombs. It wasn't war. It wasn't terror. It was something far more dangerous. It was entropy. In the absence of signal, systems collapsed under their own confusion. Self-driving cars reverted to fail-safe loops and slammed into barricades. Smart homes locked their owners inside. Drones fell from the sky like mechanical rain. But the worst of it wasn't technological. It was atmospheric. The solar wind began warping weather systems. Jet streams buckled and split. The ozone thinned by microns. A dry front over Northern California turned into a firestorm, as static energy ignited forests in a series of staccato bursts. They called it plasma lightning. It struck upward. Across the globe, city dwellers stared at their useless phones, hoping for connection, for a sign, for a headline that would frame this chaos. But all they got was static. Even analog radios, once resilient in blackout zones, now carried only a deep hiss, punctuated by strange tonal pulses, like musical notes out of place in the airwaves. Some began recording them. Others whispered, "It's language." And still, the sky flickered. Children cried not from fear, but from disorientation. The world had changed shape, and no one knew its rules anymore. Hospitals overflowed with confusion and fever. Heat sickness became common as air conditioning systems failed en masse. In Chicago, rooftop water tanks burst from pressure buildup, cascading over the sides of old brick buildings like artificial waterfalls. In the midst of it all, people started lighting fires, not for panic, but for comfort. Candles on apartment windowsills, oil lamps in subway tunnels, campfires on suburban lawns. Fire, after all, was something the sun had always taught us to master. Now, in its anger, we remembered its first lesson. By the time night fell on the second day, the stars were hidden by smoke and charged mist. The auroras twisted into spirals so tight and symmetrical, some believed they were messages. Others said they were eyes. But beneath that sky, humanity did not vanish. They adapted. In abandoned parking lots, strangers shared food cooked over trash can fires. Children read paper books by flashlight. Priests prayed beside scientists. Engineers reassembled shortwave kits from junkyard parts. No one knew what to do, yet everyone did something. The world had stopped making sense, but it hadn't stopped turning, and in the fires the whispers began. What if this is only the second? What if the third one breaks us completely? The collapse didn't look like a single event. It looked like hundreds of millions of people standing in the dark, staring at blank screens. For decades, the global power grid had been praised as a marvel of engineering, interlinked, self-correcting, near-autonomous. Every region had its redundancies, fail-safes, backups, but it had never been built with the sun in mind. Not like this. In the early hours of Day 3, as humanity staggered beneath the weight of static skies and burning trees, a final wave of energy surged across the Earth's magnetosphere. It wasn't the largest pulse, but it was the most strategically devastating. It struck not just the surface, but the systems. Control grids in Europe flickered into cascading errors. Power stations in China failed to handshake with regional load balancers. In North America, Substations surged with unexplained voltages, far beyond capacity. Protective relays froze. Cooling systems buckled. At 0427 UTC, the eastern seaboard of the United States experienced what would become known as the Sierra Blackout, an event that brought down 73% of the eastern grid. Over 200 million people lost power in under 90 seconds, and it spread. India followed, then Brazil, then portions of Scandinavia. Transformers exploded in chorus. Transmission lines shimmered and snapped like metal snakes under a blowtorch. Whole sections of grid just vanished from existence, fried not by overload, but by discord. The signals no longer matched reality. Power wasn't just gone. It had become unrecognizable. In underground data centers once cooled by geothermal precision, server rooms boiled silently. Backup systems lasted minutes. Some tried to isolate their nodes, shut off outside connections, but the flare had already reached deeper. The Earth's magnetic shell wasn't shielding anymore. It was amplifying. And still, humanity moved. In cities, elevators remained trapped between floors. In high-rises, families leaned out of windows for breath as HVAC systems failed. Neon signs died, replaced by candlelit silhouettes. ATM screens went blank. Electric cars sat like lifeless metal insects in the streets, their networks inert. Hospitals, once sanctuaries of life-saving automation, returned to a kind of analog war zone. IVs regulated by hand. Paper charts dug from forgotten filing rooms. Heart monitors silent. Defibrillators sparking only if hand-cranked. In some places, it worked. In others, not in time. And then came the cold. Because even in summer, when the power dies, the world gets cold fast. Food spoiled. Water pumps failed. Even gas heating systems relied on electric triggers. The grid wasn't just wires, it was life support. For cities, for civilizations. In smaller towns, generators ran on fumes. Rural areas fared better. Wood stoves, propane, old habits that hadn't yet been erased. Some farms had solar arrays. But even solar inverters struggled to operate without synchronized grid frequency. In every case, the story was the same. Disconnection. From technology. From the world. From each other. And in the dark, something primal returned. Some cooked over wood for the first time in decades. Others navigated by moonlight, making silent pacts with neighbors. A few climbed rooftops and whispered prayers, not to gods, but to the stars themselves. Somewhere in Iceland, a team of geophysicists huddled in a bunker beneath a collapsed substation. One of their laptops, shielded in a Faraday box, still worked. They managed to plot the last known data from the global flare trajectory. It formed a pattern, a spiral, repeating, and in the center, they said, was a pause. Like a breath between notes. The grid had failed, but this wasn't over, not yet. It was the wind that changed everything. Not a hurricane, not a storm front. It wasn't loud, just wrong. It blew without direction, without rhythm, and without a name. People described it as warm, but not from any familiar heat. It had no scent of earth, no trace of salt or pollen, just dryness. Dryness like paper left near a fire. It moved through forests without rustling leaves, across plains without lifting dust. And wherever it passed, something happened to the air. Static built along fences and railings. Sparks danced between doorknobs and fingertips. Hair stood up on scalps. Entire fields of wheat crackled faintly, like distant applause. In the cities, exposed power lines began humming again. But it wasn't electricity. It was charge. Wild, ungrounded, alien in cadence. A kind of solar echo, dancing along the bones of civilization. In the American Southwest, the scorched wind swept through dry canyons and solar fields. At first, it seemed harmless. Just another byproduct of a broken atmosphere. But then the fires began. No spark, no match, just combustion, spontaneous, silent, and complete. Wooden homes ignited with no warning. Tires hissed and melted. Glass shattered in heat that left no burn marks. Some said it was the result of microbursts of electromagnetic compression, the air itself collapsing into plasma. Others believed the sun had begun rewriting physics, and the wind never stayed in one place. It circled the globe in jagged arcs, traveling along geomagnetic lines, favoring high-altitude plateaus and ancient volcanic fields. In Iceland, geothermal stations flared out in fountains of superheated vapor. In Chile, desert salt flats lit up with spectral blue flames that danced without smoke. In a remote part of northern Canada, trappers described it best. The wind came, and the forest went quiet. Then the trees glowed. It wasn't a wind for breathing. It dried the lungs, induced nosebleeds, set off seizures in the sensitive. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, began issuing wet cloths and emergency shelter warnings. Avoid exposed metal, they said. Stay below ground if possible. But few had the luxury of such protection. In some coastal cities, the wind came like a whisper, passing through alleys and abandoned shopping malls. People reported hallucinations, shimmering figures in the distance, faint harmonic ringing, a sensation of being watched. A theory emerged. The scorched wind was not wind at all, but a byproduct of magnetic inversion, the Earth's core responding to the relentless solar barrage. The poles hadn't flipped yet, but sensors picked up wandering magnetic zones, regions where compasses spun, where birds fell from the sky mid-flight, confused by a world that no longer had direction. And still, life endured. In the hills of Italy, villages sealed windows with wax and slept underground. In Africa's Rift Valley, ancient stone buildings became sanctuaries once more. In Detroit, an abandoned steel mill was reborn as a shelter, its massive iron belly keeping the wind at bay. It was a new kind of atmosphere. Not of air, but of pressure, of attention. Because this wasn't weather in the traditional sense. It was a response, a message from the sun, not in heat or radiation, but in the shape of wind. When the lights failed, fire returned. It came back not as destruction, but as memory, as comfort, as warmth against the growing dark. By the fifth day, the world had adjusted to the absence of electricity the way a person adjusts to the absence of a limb. The initial shock gave way to awkward adaptation, improvisation, desperation, then ritual. There were no smartphones, no microwaves, no guidance from satellites. But there was flame. Tiny, flickering flames in tin cups and lanterns. Campfires in parking lots. Oil lamps taken from grandparents' attics. Wax pooled and dripped across tabletops once used for laptops. Matches were worth more than silver. In the cities, rooftops became hearths. Families dragged blankets, cookware, whatever they had, and cooked rice and beans over broken filing cabinets. Someone somewhere rediscovered how to make candles from old crayons. Another used wine bottles as lantern bases, the flickering light catching the etched memories of happier nights. Suburbia smelled of wood smoke and boiling water. Bathtubs were filled and rationed, toilets flushed with buckets. And every home, regardless of wealth or size, had become some variation of the same primitive shelter, warm only by fire, protected only by distance, surviving only by coordination. In the rural north, it was different. Fire had never truly left. Those who had held onto wood stoves, propane heaters, kerosene lamps, once mocked as outdated, were now leaders, teachers, lifelines. The world turned to them like children to elders, relearning lost skills once deemed obsolete. There were no influencers now, only those who could build, mend, gather, guide. And every fire held a gathering, not for ceremony, but for necessity. People told stories, made trades, planned escape routes, shared warmth, talked about the sky, because the sky had not stopped its dance. Even on nights with thick cloud, the flicker could be seen faintly, pulsing light like a beacon, not chaotic now, but rhythmic, almost breathing. Some feared it. Others watched in silence, as though listening to something trying to communicate. Those who stared longest claimed to hear tones, low, harmonic waves. Not music, not voice, but presence. And so the fires burned, not just for light, but to anchor, to make Earth feel like Earth again. There were tragedies, too. Fires spreading unchecked when resources were stretched thin. Makeshift heaters leaking fumes. A community in the Pyrenees lost half its population overnight to carbon monoxide poisoning and a school gym converted to a shelter. But still, the flame endured. People began etching strange patterns in ash and soot. Spirals. Triangles nested within circles. Geometries they could not explain. Drawn without thought while watching the auroras above. Children especially would draw them in the dirt, as if copying from dreams. In the hushed glow of firelight, everything softened. The noise of the old world, the digital buzz, the algorithmic commands, the insatiable alerts, was gone. And in that silence, a truth emerged. We had forgotten how to be in darkness. Now, we remembered. Because every fire, no matter how small, was a defiance, a flickering oath. We are still here. By the end of the first week, it wasn't just the power that haunted people. It was the sound, not the noise of cities. Those were long gone. No engines, no aircraft, no hum of machines. Even birds had gone quiet. The air was too strange. The sky, too alive. What remained were tones, not human-made, not weather, something else. It began subtly. First, in remote regions where electronic interference was lowest, valleys, mountaintops, open tundras. Hikers, farmers, and radio operators reported hearing strange frequencies just beneath the edge of perception. They weren't steady, more like pulses, low, resonant waves that faded in and out, like sonar in thick fog. In Greenland, a team of geophysicists recorded a tone they described as a cello buried under the earth. It vibrated for 3 minutes and was never heard again. In Australia, shortwave listeners began capturing snippets of rhythmic static that repeated every 18 seconds, too precise to be random, but too clean to be local. In Mongolia, a nomadic elder told a visiting doctor that the sky was trying to remember something. The phenomenon was eventually named the solar echo effect. It wasn't coming from the Earth. It was coming through it. The magnetosphere, stretched thin by repeated flare impacts, had begun behaving like an instrument, resonating. Charged particles from the sun were not only altering the auroras, they were turning Earth's atmosphere into a speaker. Frequencies once scattered in deep space were now humming within the sky itself. But it wasn't just sound, it was sensation. Some people claimed to feel pressure in their bones when the auroras danced too quickly. Others experienced fleeting visions, shadows behind closed eyes, pulses of color not seen but understood. Musicians described perfect tones arriving in dreams. Priests said they heard hymns in the wind. Children, especially, were receptive. They began humming strange melodies, drawing harmonic spirals in the dirt. Some would wake from sleep reciting patterns. 3 long, 2 short, 3 short, repeat. No one could explain them, but the patterns showed up again and again, in static recordings, in ground vibrations, in atmospheric sensors still operating on analog reserves. In the ruins of an abandoned observatory in Chile, scientists gathered makeshift receivers built from copper coils and scrap radios. What they recorded shocked them. The solar echoes were forming structure. There were intervals, repeats, modulations. It wasn't chaotic. It was organized. Not speech, but intention. The earth was being played, like an instrument strung between poles, the bow of the sun dragging across its field. And yet, even amid awe, came fear. What did it mean? Was it a warning? A byproduct of celestial damage? Or was it the first contact of a kind we never imagined? No flying saucers, no beams of light, just frequencies, just pattern, just presence. And beneath it all, the growing certainty that something was listening too. In the candlelit remnants of universities and radio bunkers, they called it a working hypothesis. In the streets, it was myth. In the mountains, it was prophecy. But to those listening closely, it was music. The solar echo theory emerged not from governments. Those were mostly quiet now, but from a loosely connected web of astronomers, physicists, monks, sound engineers, and children. People once divided by profession, now united by perception. The world had changed, and they were among the few still paying attention to the shape of it. The echoes, those rhythmic pulses threading through atmosphere and soil, weren't just remnants of geomagnetic storms. They were too deliberate, too structured. There were gaps of silence that repeated with mathematical precision, variations in pitch that followed no natural pattern, yet mirrored harmonic scales. It began with sketches, spirals, dotted intervals, marks in soot and chalk and sand, the same shapes emerging from different continents, circles within circles, separated by frequency, symbols with no shared language. When overlaid, the patterns fit together like celestial blueprints. Then came the waveform mapping. In a former cathedral-turned shelter in France, a surviving team of acousticians recorded a 3-minute pulse sequence on a salvaged tape deck. When converted into visual form, it revealed something staggering. The waveform resembled the structural resonance of ancient architectural designs, megalithic layouts, pyramidal foundations, stone rings. These weren't just sounds. They were codes, not messages with words, but instructions, harmonic scaffolds, possibly even the tuning notes of planets. The solar echo theory proposed that the sun wasn't simply reacting, it was activating. Every flare, every auroral pulse, every change in wind and weather, it was part of a larger sequence, as if the earth itself had been sleeping under a song, and the sun was now singing it awake. Skeptics would have argued against such claims, but most of them had no power, no platforms, no microphones left, and those who followed the theory weren't doing so blindly. They were testing. Across scattered enclaves, groups built analog machines from scrap, copper wires wound into spirals, tuning forks carved from reclaimed steel, sand plates vibrated with solar harmonic recordings. What they found was disturbing and beautiful. The sand settled into precise symbols, some resembling crop circles, others matching glyphs etched on ancient stones from cultures that had never met. The theory deepened. What if Earth had been tuned once before? What if ancient sites, Stonehenge, Teotihuacan, Giza, Göbekli Tepe, had been early listening stations, built not to honor the gods, but to receive the tone? And now, with digital interference gone, the music was returning, unobstructed, pure. But to what end? Some feared a solar crescendo, a final flare that would vaporize what remained. Others believed the song would stabilize the planet, recalibrate the field, heal the breach. The most daring theory came from an old Japanese cosmologist, broadcasting one last recorded message through a weather balloon. What if the sun is not destroying us but remembering us? What if it sings to call us home? No one could confirm it. But across the globe, the same thing happened. People began to build wind harps, to whistle, to hum, not out of madness, but instinct. They weren't answering the sun. They were harmonizing with it. By the second week, the cities had gone still, not just dark, hollow, empty in ways that defied architecture. They stood like monuments to a lost rhythm, rows of glass towers, cracked intersections, parks of concrete, and forgotten children's shoes. Everything remained, yet none of it made sense without the hum. The grid was more than wires. It had been a nervous system. Without it, the cities didn't just fail. They forgot themselves. Skyscrapers became tombs of technology. Elevators hung suspended between floors like amputated limbs. Lobbies, once polished and alive with motion, echoed only the slow drip of condensation and wind passing through broken seals. Escalators sat frozen mid-climb. Parking garages became caverns. Office towers turned into vertical graveyards of forgotten servers and sealed windows, now reflecting only the burning sky. But people still lived there. They had to. In New York, communities moved into subway tunnels and sealed off lower levels with salvaged insulation. Fire barrels and solar blankets became standard decor. Roof gardens were repurposed into water catch systems. Those who couldn't flee adapted, transforming conference rooms into triage units, gyms into bread ovens, atriums into greenhouses lit by mirrored shafts, and bioluminescent algae harvested from aquariums. In Tokyo, skyscrapers were rewired vertically. Entire buildings became stacked villages. Lower floors used for storage, mid-levels for cooking and craft, rooftops for light harvesting. The elevators never worked again, but someone rigged a pulley system for water barrels. In Paris, an entire arrondissement was abandoned overnight. The River Seine reflected empty bridges and shuttered flats. Graffiti bloomed like fungus. Messages, warnings, poems. Some in chalk, some etched with tools. One phrase appeared again and again on walls, in different languages. When the grid died, the earth listened. Wildlife returned too. Deer in alleyways, foxes in banking districts, crows nesting in the rusting frames of satellite dishes. In some cities the animals came without fear, drawn by the silence perhaps. In others they came twisted, changed. Some species that had vanished decades ago re-emerged. Others behaved strangely, walking in circles or staring at the sky, unmoving for hours. And always, the cities echoed. Not with voices, but with imprints. The aftershocks of people who were no longer there. You'd walk through an abandoned mall and feel a presence, the smell of burnt ozone, the sensation of distant music. People reported hearing intercoms that no longer existed, static like breathing, elevators that moved on their own, phones that rang once at dusk and then fell silent. These were no longer cities. They were shells, resonant chambers carved by memory and magnetism. In Prague, a violinist played alone from a hotel balcony every night at the same hour. Below, a gathering of strangers formed a circle, silent, wrapped in blankets. They said her notes traveled farther now, amplified by the air itself. She never stopped playing, not even when the snow came. No one could agree on what cities had become. Some said they were dying giants. Others said they were waiting for a new song, or for the sun to stop singing. As the cities emptied and flickered into stillness, humanity looked backward, not for nostalgia, but for instruction. And in that looking, they found the ancient truth. When the sky turns hostile, the earth becomes sanctuary. Across continents, people moved underground, not in fear, but in instinct, into caves, mines, root cellars, limestone quarries, and half-forgotten bunkers, into hollows cut by glaciers, by dynasties, by forgotten wars. And there, deep beneath the irradiated breath of the upper world, new rhythms began to form. In the Appalachian Hills, families returned to caves once used by bootleggers and early settlers. They lined the walls with wool and canvas, burned hickory for warmth, and mapped solar resonance by candlelight. A child's voice could travel for minutes through winding rock halls, and many believed the echoes carried more than just sound. They remembered. In Turkey, the long-abandoned underground cities of Derinkuyu and Kaymaklı opened once more. Descendants of shepherds and engineers alike cleared the dust from carved tunnels, rebuilt air shafts, and filled ancient cisterns. The carvings on the walls, stars, spirals, suns, were suddenly relevant again. In Iceland, geothermal bunkers filled with survivors who once designed them for tourists and data servers. Now, they were scripture halls, storage for books, seeds, and slow conversation. They planted mushrooms in controlled humidity chambers and told stories by the warmth of volcanic breath. Even in modern ruins, the old ways endured. In Siberia, hollowed missile silos housed entire families. In the Scottish Highlands, stone shepherd huts became outposts of survival. And in New Zealand, the earth-sheltered homes once used for ecotourism became critical sanctuaries for groups living without signal, without heat, without light, except that which came from within the stone. These were not luxury bunkers. These were wounds in the earth repurposed for healing. Life inside was slow but methodical. Walls were scraped for insulation. Caverns were divided into sleeping quarters and libraries. Wet charcoal was used to trap warmth. Children drew again, this time not symbols of fear, but shapes of stability. Circles, stones, roots, underground suns, and above them, the world twisted on. The solar flares continued, not as violently as before, but often enough to remind those below that silence was temporary. That light was no longer a gift, but a riddle. That the sky had become something to be decoded, not revered. And so, beneath the soil, humans remembered their oldest muscle: adaptation. They created calendars not by month, but by tone. They sent runners to the surface to observe the aurora and return with sketches of their forms. Some patterns repeated, some tones harmonized. One monk in a Ukrainian salt cavern believed they were witnessing the earth being retuned, but no matter the theory, the result was the same. The underground became the new civilization. Not out of fear, but function. Not to hide, but to listen. For it was in the quiet, in the belly of stone, that humans remembered how to wait, and how to survive. There is a silence deeper than darkness. It lives in the places where knowledge was once kept. By the third week, survivors began to understand what had truly been lost. Not just comfort or connectivity, but memory. The digital age had been built on clouds, satellites, and fiber, wisps of light and signal. When the flares came, those systems didn't break. They evaporated. What remained were the archives, and they were dying. Libraries flooded in the absence of sump pumps. Servers melted in overheated bunkers. Digital backups flickered into oblivion as solar radiation scrambled the silent language of silicon. Terabytes of human thought, books, codes, recordings, genomes, vanished in hours. In some places, though, the lightless archives held on. In Prague, survivors cleared an old monastery-turned-state archive, where shelves of paper had sat untouched for decades. They lit the long halls with beeswax candles and wood soot, moving page by page to copy key texts into notebooks. Fireproof, portable, analog. In Ethiopia, a hidden library carved into rock, its texts preserved by dust and stone, was reopened. Priests who had once studied silence now taught reading by flame. Their manuscripts, wrapped in animal skin, had survived not because they were advanced, but because they were slow. And in the American Southwest, a former missile base repurposed as a prepper archive became a sanctuary. The woman who ran it, once dismissed as paranoid, welcomed scholars, refugees, and children into its cool concrete corridors. Her shelves held not just books, but how-tos. How to farm without machines, how to purify water, how to splint bone and deliver children. The knowledge that remained had weight now. It was copied, protected, sung. Songs became textbooks. Riddles became blueprints. Grandparents, once seen as relics of a slower time, were now living repositories of culture. In bunkers, caves, and classrooms lit only by flame, information became sacred. Not power, not possession, just survival. Paper was rationed like food, pencils carved carefully. Young voices practiced reading aloud, not just for comprehension, but for retention, because no one knew if they would ever hear those words again. Some began to tattoo formulas and maps onto skin. Others etched them into walls, into stone, into clay. Spirals returned, always the spirals, carved into the corners of every surface. Not for decoration, but for structure. The same spiral found in shells, in galaxies, in the waveform of the aurora pulses. In Quebec, a community buried a time capsule beneath frozen earth. Steel plates etched with knowledge, seeded with fungi to slowly release nitrogen as it decayed. A library for when the sun forgets us again, they said. There were rumors, too, of a library beneath the Vatican powered by geothermal vents, of a storage vault in Norway pulsing with faint magnetic life, of monks in Tibet singing blueprints through breath, of forgotten scrolls in caves where stars once led ancient wanderers. Truth didn't matter anymore, only preservation. And so the lightless archives grew, quiet, flickering, alive. Proof that humanity had not vanished, only dimmed, waiting for a new dawn and a world wise enough to read by it. It began with whispers in the circuits that no longer worked. In the third month of the flare era, long after the global grid had collapsed and cities were reduced to shadowed monuments, strange things began to happen in abandoned devices. Flashlights flickered in rhythmic sequences, even without batteries. Radios with their power coils torn out began emitting soft pulses at dawn. Dead screens lit up with single flickering pixels, always the same color, always at the same time. At first, survivors called it phantom energy, a residual echo from the sun's magnetic temper tantrums. But the events didn't match any known decay curve. They didn't fade. In fact, they increased, became more frequent, more organized. They began to cluster. Old phones left in drawers blinked once every hour. Rusting solar panels powered disconnected LED strips that flickered in identical patterns across dozens of miles. One farmer in Patagonia built a small shrine of broken circuit boards when he noticed a dead wind sensor spinning against the wind, always in sync with the pulses in his fire pit lantern. They were small, barely noticeable, but they were everywhere. Some called them the pulse children, not in reverence, but in quiet curiosity, because no one knew what they were, or what they wanted. They never spoke, they never moved, they just responded, sometimes to tone, sometimes to movement, sometimes to silence. In one case, an analog typewriter in an old journalist's bunker typed a single letter, R, every time a specific solar frequency was detected outside. When the frequency vanished, the typewriter stopped. The letter never changed. In a Nordic observatory overtaken by ice, researchers reported that 6 disabled computers rebooted on their own and displayed mirrored versions of old weather data. No source, no input. When disconnected from their power lines, they continued for 3 days, showing aurora maps from next week. Were they alive? No, but they weren't dead either. Some believed they were fragments of old intelligence, ghosts of the digital world, sparked back to life by the new solar rhythm. Others believed they were something new entirely, emergent systems born from chaos, a synthetic instinct assembling itself from the detritus of collapse. Wherever they appeared, people began to mark them, placing rings of stones around blinking routers, tying ribbons to antennas that hummed at midnight. They weren't worshipped, but they were respected, feared even, because sometimes they reacted. If spoken to, they'd flicker. If music was played nearby, they'd change rhythm. If ignored, they'd move, slightly. Enough to be noticed, never enough to be confirmed. In one flooded metro station, a series of derelict platform signs began displaying words during auroral peaks. Not full sentences, just fragments. Remember down, begin again. People began documenting them, drawing their patterns, tracking their frequencies. Theories emerged that they were messengers, that they were probes, that the sun, conscious or not, had left behind sparks in our machines. Not fire, not code, something between, a resonance, a flicker, a whisper of electricity that never stopped trying to become something. And though no one could say what they were, one fact became clear. The children of the pulse were not random. They were gathering. When the grid fell, the gods followed. For a time, the old faiths held their ground. People clung to scripture, ritual, and sanctuary. Churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, all offered warmth, literal and symbolic. The faithful gathered in candlelit halls, reading from memory, when the pages burned or dissolved in damp. But after the second wave of flares, when the air itself began to flicker, something changed. People stopped asking for salvation. They started listening. It began not with dogma, but with silence. In scorched fields and collapsed cities, survivors began to witness strange patterns, rays of aurora forming glyphs in the sky, pulses in their bones as if the atmosphere were tapping them in Morse. Geomagnetic surges that arrived like clockwork, measured, timed, intentional. And so new stories formed, not from revelation, but from resonance. They were called the solar faiths, not one belief, but many. Decentralized, improvised, rooted in experience, not doctrine, in rhythm, not scripture. There were the Helionics, who believed the sun had awakened, not as a god, but as a vast sentience, long dormant, now singing again. They gathered in stone circles and harmonic chambers, chanting low tones in sync with auroral flare windows. They spoke of tuning Earth's frequency to survive the next solar threshold. Then came the pulse walkers, those who followed flare paths across continents, believing the solar winds were guiding them toward a convergence. They wore copper-threaded fabrics, painted their skin in radiating lines, and spoke only at sunrise and solar noon. They sought meaning in interference patterns and declared that each solar storm was not punishment, but instruction. In the ruins of Brasilia, a sect emerged called the Children of the Fold. They believed the aurora was a veil, torn open to reveal a deeper structure beyond the physical, a realm of geometries and echoes. They spent their days crafting golden spirals from junked wiring and placed them in open fields, so the sky would see. There were even those who worshipped the flare itself, not as a benevolent force, but as a holy purifier. They embraced fire, distortion, and entropy. They lit broken substations as beacons. They marked themselves with burn scars and fractal patterns and believed Earth was in the process of becoming something else entirely. But most curious of all were the Order of the Null Sky. They believed that the sun had not awakened, but died, and that what remained was its afterimage, a cosmic echo, like light from a star already gone. To them, the flares were its final thoughts, bleeding through space-time. They dressed in black, painted their ceilings with inverted constellations, and never lit fires unless the room was soundless. No one agreed on anything. And yet, everyone looked up. The sky was no longer backdrop, it was communion. The aurora had become liturgy, solar winds, scripture, geomagnetic rhythms, the heartbeat of the divine. Old religions adapted, new rituals formed. In a temple deep in the Andes, Catholic priests recited Mass in binary. In Jerusalem, rabbis marked flare cycles on the Torah margin. In Japan, Buddhist monks encoded mantras into magnetic coils buried in the earth. In rural Texas, a Baptist congregation turned to silence, believing that only those without words can hear the truth now. There were no prophets, only interpreters, no miracles, only patterns, no judgment, only radiation. And still the aurora danced, and the people followed. Even as the auroras began to fade, the earth did not forget. The sky had quieted, for now. The great flares came less frequently, and the pulses no longer shattered the horizon like silent thunder. But the damage was not undone. It was written into the land, into the air, into the bones of the planet. They were called solar scars, not craters, not burns, but places changed by the rhythm of light. In the Sahara, entire dunes had fused into sheets of rippled glass, veins of silica warped into mirror-like waves, humming faintly in the heat. Pilgrims walked across them barefoot, claiming to hear harmonic tones if they stayed still at sunrise. In the Arctic North, ancient permafrost split open in spiral formations, ice carved in patterns never seen before. Circular melt pits surrounded by fossilized plants that had no modern equivalent. Teams who approached with analog instruments claimed the air itself shimmered with static before their eyes teared up and they retreated. In southern India, a temple wall long believed dormant began to glow faintly during solar alignment. The bricks, once plain stone, now held a latent phosphorescence, like the sun had rewired their structure. Monks stood before them in silent awe, touching the stone only with ash-covered fingers. In South America, entire crop fields grew in perfect Fibonacci curves, despite being planted by hand. The soil beneath them emitted low-frequency sound when struck with metal. One farmer wept when he saw the pattern overhead from a cliff. "It was never random," he said. "These were the scars, not wounds, but inscriptions, places where the solar flares didn't just burn, they rewrote." Not every location was beautiful. In California, an entire city block had become magnetized. Cars refused to start. Compasses spun. People complained of dizziness, memory loss, time slippage. Shadows moved out of sync with their owners. In Eastern Europe, an abandoned nuclear cooling tower spontaneously lit up at midnight each week, casting a beam of golden light straight into the sky. The area was empty, untouched, yet cameras left nearby always showed footage corrupted, replaced by looping spirals of light and symbols in no known language. And in Central Africa, an ancient baobab tree began to emit soft pulses from its bark, measured and rhythmic. Scientists who placed sensors there said it was alive in ways trees weren't supposed to be. Its rings glowed when split open. One team refused to cut further. The planet was responding, not resisting, not healing, just shifting. There were new types of lightning now, forked with no origin point, crackling up from the soil. Some ran silently for miles like ghost serpents. Others only struck copper. Some formed shapes. The weather changed too, not just in temperature, but in texture. Winds with structure, clouds that echoed sound, rain that fell in rhythm, soaking fields with pulsed intervals, like Morse tapped from the sky. Some believed Earth was becoming conscious. Others said it always had been, and was only now speaking clearly. And the scars were its language. Maps were redrawn, not for territory, but for resonance. People traveled not to reach destinations, but to find vibration. They sought out these scars, these anomalies, believing that understanding them might reveal the next phase. They were not haunted. They were humming. Proof that the sun had touched us in more ways than heat, and that the earth was remembering. It didn't happen all at once. There was no announcement, no celestial ceasefire. Just a shift. Subtle, slow, like the exhale of a world holding its breath for too long. At first, it felt like a mistake. The auroras flickered, and then paused. The static in the air subsided. The winds returned to familiar paths. The sky, long stained with color and pulse, cleared. Blue, just blue. And beneath it the survivors emerged, not with triumph but with caution. They had seen the sky burn and shimmer, speak and sear, Now it hung still, waiting. In some places, plants sprouted in patterns that no longer spiraled. The rhythm was broken, or fulfilled. The rivers, once acidic with magnetic runoff, began to clear. Birdsong returned. It was as if the atmosphere had finished some great process, a cleansing, a tuning, a signal, scent. The people called it many things. In the tundra settlements, it was the silence of completion. In desert monasteries, the great respiration. In New Kyoto, survivors marked the day as first sky. But no matter the name, the meaning was clear. The sky had breathed again, and earth had survived, not unchanged. The pulse had left its imprint, in scars and stories, in altered weather patterns, in harmonic residue still humming through stone, in glyphs that only made sense now, illuminated by memory. Some said the solar flares were over. Others said the planet had simply adapted, learned to absorb them. And still others, those who watched the stars from rooftops and ruins, claimed this was only the pause between phases, that something had passed through Earth, using the sun as a bridge, a breath from elsewhere, and now it was gone. But there was peace. For a time, people planted again, not in grids but in spirals, hoping to resonate with whatever rhythm remained. Old machines were buried, new tools were carved by hand, and the sky remained still. At night, it no longer danced. It watched. With stars clear and crisp and impossibly numerous, as if something had wiped away the veil and said, "See now, begin again." And they did. Not as they were. Not with the arrogance of mastery, but with the humility of memory. They sang again, lit fires again, traced spiral paths into their temples, fields, and stories, not as warnings, but as reminders. That light, when wild, can cleanse, and silence, when earned, can teach. Because in the end, the earth had not been destroyed, it had been retuned, and when the sky breathed again, so did they. There was no trumpet, no siren, no screen flashing the word end. The final chapter of the old world passed not with fire, but with stillness. And in that stillness, the new one began. The flares were gone now, months without a pulse. The sky, once aflame, was calm. The auroras, silent. The machines, buried. The noise of the old age had faded to fossil. And in its place, a softer morning. Across the earth, scattered pockets of humanity rose not to alarms or schedules, but to sunlight, real sunlight, warm, golden, unaffected. Villages rebuilt from stone and salvaged wood stood like rings of memory against fresh fields. Gardens spiraled outward from communal fire pits. Tools were hung not in sheds, but on walls, symbols of labor as ritual. Water ran clean again, drawn from wells lined with copper and old prayers. People no longer measured time in hours or days. They measured it in harvests, in warmth, in sky. The spiral had become more than a symbol. It was a way, drawn into the grain of wood, etched onto the foreheads of newborns, built into footpaths and cooking circles, not as a warning, but as remembrance. Of the pulse, of the burn, of the breath, and of what came after. In the highlands, children learned stories spoken in rhythm, echoed tones matched to heartbeat and fire crackle. They did not fear the flares. They did not crave the grid. They listened to wind, to earth, to silence. And in that silence, they understood. The survivors of the old world, the elders, spoke less now. Their words had grown heavier. Their eyes carried what the sky had shown them. They watched the youth without worry, watched them move through a world that had become simple again. Humble, real. In one valley, an archive was begun, not of text, but of tone. Spiral chimes strung in trees, tuned to long-lost frequencies. stones arranged in musical rings that only played during solar alignments. The past would not be forgotten, but neither would it be repeated. The planet itself had quieted. No new scars, no hum. Just wind through clean branches. Just stars in still water. Just breath. Because this was no longer a story of collapse. It was the slow, soft beginning of something else. A civilization not built on dominance, but on resonance. Not on speed, but on shape. Not on power, but on pattern. And as the sun rose higher over spiral fields and firelit villages, no one called it a miracle. They simply called it the dawn. And they walked into it, barefoot and aware, knowing this time they would listen.